reaction to that decision by the former Deputy Chief Justice, Dikgang Moseneke. His recommendation then that local government elections be postponed until the end of February, or take place by the end of February. In other words, they would not take place on his recommendation by the end of October this year. This, of course, because of COVID-19. Well, reaction coming through. Professor Barry Hanyane is a professor of politics at Northwest University. Mmusi Maimane is the leader of the One South Africa movement, one of the people who argued that elections should, in fact, go ahead. Mmusi Maimane, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time. I know it's short notice. I do appreciate it. Your first reaction to this news, you would have seen what the former Deputy Chief Justice had to say. He clearly has considered their options very, very closely. What do you make of it?
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to fellow South Africans. And whilst I hear and understand the report that has been tabled by Justice Moseneke, we are still disappointed that elections are not going ahead in October. And I think he went to great lengths to argue the case about regularity and free and fairness. I am a reasonable human being and understand the fact that during a COVID time, you wouldn't want to place lives at risk. And so therefore, the 4 months deferment needs to be treated with the absolute priority that it requires. We need to ensure that in the 4 months, because frankly, it's big speculation to say that in February we may very well be in a different conditions. Countries that have even gone through vaccination programs still have considerations that they need to put on the table. I think we mustn't lose the priority of saying we must restore local government, because the longer we keep this government in place, or this term of office extended for much longer, the higher the risk of citizens who are staying at home without water and electricity, and a poor governance model is being maintained. So whilst we're disappointed at the finding, we uphold the fact that the 4 months ought to be critically managed so that we can get elections going as soon as possible.
Obviously, it's early days, Mmusi, and I'm sure you haven't had a moment to really think about it. None of us have. But it is entirely possible that there'll be court action on this. I think there might also be a debate around whether we actually have to change the constitution and go the parliamentary route. Do you have a view on that at this stage? Are you going to accept the decision even though you disagree with it, or do you believe that you might challenge it? I would suspect that other people might challenge it even if you don't.
Yeah, look, I'm willing to accept the decision. Obviously, as the recommendations have come from Justice Moseneke, is that a competent court be found. I imagine that will probably fall in the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court, and our Constitution has been silent as to which conditions ought to be in place for a postponement to occur. We understand the nature of the fact that we are well in the midst of a pandemic, and so rationality ought to apply and the safeguarding of human beings ought to come on board. But given all of those, I think what we will be monitoring is, again, the proposals we've made. Can we digitize the way people register to vote? Can we ensure that political campaigns are held in a manner that is safe? And how do we ensure that, because these conditions, if we do not manage the next 4 months period well, another type of scenario of this nature may occur, and then the precedent and the argument that says you've granted it once, you can do it again, then becomes even more applicable over and over again.
Professor Barry Hanyane, I never thought in all of my days that we would live in a democratic South Africa where there'll be a recommendation that we postpone an election, and actually, from the public opinion figures I've seen, most people will probably be pretty happy with that. It tells you what the pandemic has done to our society and how scared we are of the disease, correctly so.
Stephen, good afternoon to you, your viewers, Mr. Maimane. Look, it's unprecedented, really, where a governance-related process is subjected to the pressures of preserving human life, as is the case right now with the prevalence of the pandemic itself. But overall, look, I'm satisfied with the way in which this whole exercise was carried. It was carried out of advice from science. That incredible panel of 9 members who were able to provide input, although differing in certain instances, but in the end, a consensus established. What is also interesting in his opening remarks, the former Deputy Chief Justice made it clear that the IEC doesn't have to accept the recommendations. But I'm of the view that this is the only piece of advice that they have at this point in time, and they would want to go with it and make sure that the remaining months that we have, logistics are put in place. Rightly, this brings a lot of pressure on political parties themselves to, as Mr. Maimane alluded to earlier on, to reform in the way they behave, to reform in the way they interact with their constituencies. And some parties, including, by the way, independent candidates, whom I feel very passionate about, do not have the necessary resources to undertake that enormous task of putting themselves before all their constituencies. So it's a new platform altogether for everybody, but more importantly, setting new grounds for developments and, of course, informing local government in the near future.
Mmusi Maimane, I mean, you described yourself as a reasonable person a few moments ago. I wonder if there's a root of greater division in our society in that some parties may believe passionately, as you do, but you've agreed to accept the decision. I completely respect that. But some people may, I suppose, be slightly unreasonable in this. And what I'm really worried about, let me try and put the question more plainly, I'm worried that the argument about whether or not the elections should happen itself divides our society at a time when we're so incredibly divided.
No, it is understandable, and that's why I think it ought to be brought to a competent court to manage that process. I do think, Stephen, one of the great difficulties that South Africa faces at the moment is almost a leadership that is ambiguous and exemplified by even the slight skirmish or disagreement between the Minister of Defense and the presidency. But all of these mixed messages, where we prepared for looting last week, where we're not, the rollout of vaccination, much of the report hinges on the fact that we would hope that by February we've reached some form of community immunity. And ultimately, when you project that, should there be any disruptions to that vaccination process, you will have other difficulties. So when there's that type of scenario occurring within any society, you ultimately cede to the rule of law, and the argument around the regularity of elections then becomes paramount. So I'm accepting a 4 months delay with a sense of going that we cannot, as the Justice has already indicated, seek a further delay. But furthermore, our country ought to be united around this one basic rule, which is to say the supremacy of the Constitution must hold. That's why we have a Constitution in place, because there'll be many issues that we disagree on and perhaps could lead us to divisions. But we cannot be divided on the supremacy of the rule of law. And that's why I think it's important that we treat this moment with the respect that it deserves, because otherwise, if you start adjusting your constitutional provisions as and when people feel, another government will use different circumstances to find a space to postpone a national election or a different election. So that's why I think supremacy of the rule of law here is important.
Professor, I mean, one of the things that really matters here is whether people accept it. So it almost doesn't matter if the Electoral Commission goes to court and no one opposes them, all the political parties accept it. So just off the top of my head, we know the EFF wanted to postpone elections, so they won't oppose this decision. The DA did say that they wanted the elections to go ahead. It may depend on whether or not they decide to oppose this in court or not. Difficult decision for them. We'll try and get a reaction from them in a moment to this. What I'm trying to get to is that if all the parties representing all of the political constituencies in South Africa agree to the postponement, then there's no problem. But if some people disagree and feel that we should go to voters now, then we are going to have a problem.
Well, Stephen, I wish it was that simple, especially when due consideration is directed towards the pandemic. Nobody for certain can tell us that come December, come January, we won't have the fourth wave. And who knows, perhaps the third wave itself might prolong. One thing is for certain, it seems the pandemic will be with us for quite some time. And it's going to affect public life in one way or another. My biggest concern is, to what degree do we guarantee freedom to campaign, freedom to make sure that our constituencies has access to voter education, has access to voter material, access to to those that they want to vote for in terms of checking whether indeed these persons are capable to represent their interests. So there's a lot at stake here. But one thing that I take leave from the presentation is the fact that I think the IEC has been given a lifeline in ensuring that the extended time does provide for voter registration, which speaks to issues of logistics and all other matters that must be attended to. So permutations are there, but I don't think we can sit here comfortably and pretty much start planning with a full understanding that some kind of trajectory will inform all processes.
Still so much to discuss. Mmusi Maimane, thank you very much indeed for your time, sir. I do appreciate it. Professor Barry Hanyane, if we can ask you just to stay with us a few more moments. Noon, of course, breaking news. The panel led by the former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke has recommended to the Electoral Commission, the IEC, that it will not be possible to have free and fair local government elections at the end of October as previously planned because of COVID-19. Instead, the panel has made a recommendation today that elections could be considered to be free and fair if they're held no later than the end of February next year. This, of course, is a momentous moment in our democratic history, the postponement of an election. The panel further recommending that the Electoral Commission approach a competent court. There is, of course, an electoral court and a constitutional court. The lawyers will have to decide which one and ask for a deferment of the elections. I must just tell you, it is possible that this might actually also need to go to Parliament. Professor Barry Hanyane explaining all of this to us. He, of course, at the University of North West, a professor of politics there. Now, Professor Hanyane, let's just pick it up on this, because it's one thing to make a recommendation that the Electoral Commission can go to court. I'm no lawyer, but I have had a lawyer explain to me once that a court cannot make new law. In other words, they can't look at the Constitution, which says very clearly you have to have elections within 5 years and 3 months of the last election, and then just decide you can have 5 years and 9 months between elections. This could actually turn into quite a complex legal argument.
No, absolutely. But thank goodness our democratic infrastructure, to use that term very carefully, actually allows that your parliament be the seat from which such kind of amendments, if needs be, can be made, and then of course rectified later. What is interesting is that we should not lose sight of the fact that local government does enjoy a measure of independence. By saying that local government has the power to decide its fate without interference from the other spheres of government. That is the beauty about our system. So I do see a sense of your architects, from a policy perspective, from local government, contributing immensely in, of course, not shaping the discourse, but contributing towards giving us a direction that we can follow, which is within the prescript of our constitutional democracy.
Different parties obviously wanted different things here. I mean, for the first instance, it means that political parties, in a way, have more time to campaign. I would imagine for the ANC, considering the problems that we've seen of the last week, some of the divisions that we've seen, it may give the governing party a little bit more time to recover in some ways.
Stephen, we've got to treat that with a pinch of salt. And I'm happy that the former Deputy Chief Justice touched on this issue. Other parties are bigger than others. So by virtue of that, it means certain parties have amassed resources to be able to cushion and deal with the challenges as we see them today going forward. Imagine an independent candidate in a rural settlement who would want to campaign without resources such as office, a car, material to distribute to potential voters and supporters. Unfortunately, this proportionality will come out and will favor your big guns at the expense of small parties and independent candidates. And this issue must be addressed in order to create an equal platform for all, so that in the end, the issue of parity, the issue of free and fairness as principles guiding our elections are actually achieved and observed.
So there are going to be various sort of views that come through on all of this. It's still an immense decision. We still have the Electoral Commission obviously has to do their necessary steps. In a way, it shows also that the Commission was right to commission an independent panel at this moment. This was actually a very clever move. It diffuses a lot of the politics.
Which is good, and it has allowed a platform for partisan expressions, which in themselves are somewhat diverse, and this panel does acknowledge that indeed they have observed that, but going forward, such contributions did not necessarily influence the position that they've arrived at, which then brings us to the position of appreciating that some kind of multidisciplinary methodology was applied in this instance, from taking political views to soliciting inputs from the scientific community, and of course looking at issues of logistics. So it's from where I stand, I think it's a balanced position that this panel has been able to present to us, albeit we haven't scrutinized the report very closely. But hearing the former Chief Justice explain himself, I think this is a milestone, and it should be somewhat be welcomed.
There's a strange mood in the country, Professor Hanyane, and I mean, a mood is very difficult to assess. I can't just say there's a mood by, sensing it in the ether. But we certainly saw last week that there's a lot of anger and frustration in the country, and a lot of that's to do with COVID-19, the lockdowns that were implemented to counter the impacts of that, and just, where we are generally, particularly around the economy and now inequality. Now, having an election in an angry mood can be a dangerous thing. On the other hand, voting can make people feel better. Could an election have maybe calmed the country? I realize that's a strange question to ask.
Not really. It's more appropriate at a time when, rightly so, the temperature in the country may very well be a little bit hostile, and that anger obviously directed at the authorities, and somewhere between that crossfire is bystanders such as your companies and a lot of these malls looted, becoming the victim of the process. But it goes beyond that. My understanding is we need to look at other variables that would assist us to understand the dynamics in the country. Issues of literacy, for instance, issues of public awareness, measuring interest in politics. We shouldn't run away from the fact that an election is, by in its nature, a political activity, and people might easily dismiss any potential interest in participating into it, and of course eventually exercising their right to vote. These are issues that I think in this country we still have to battle with, on top of issues that we know are there, your triple challenges, issues of poverty, issues of unemployment. All of these variables, I'm afraid, will have some kind of impact and influence when it comes to making choices come hopefully next year in February.
Professor, I mean, another big question for you. Do you think that this delay is going to change the results of the elections in any way? I mean, most people will be focused perhaps on the big metros. Those are the symbols of various things. But in lots of different places, there are lots of different local dynamics. Do you think a delay actually changes the results? Or do you think, in a way, it's not really going to make that much of a difference? And I realize, during an election campaign, Professor Hanyane, I don't need to tell you this, anything can happen.
No, absolutely. 2016 was that bedrock where we took important lessons. Who would have predicted that we'll have coalitions in metros, the ANC dropping in terms of support base, getting all those figures and crunching them up and realizing that indeed the element of predictability when it comes to issues of local government elections in particular is somewhat sketchy and somewhat elusive. I, however, hold the view that come, hopefully, February 2022, we will see the consolidation of that movement of coalition governments. I don't think the broader support of the ANC will dwindle extensively and significantly. They might hold, but I would like to see the footprint being made by independent candidates on the basis that come 2024, hopefully independent candidates will feature strongly in the national government elections, which then says the culture of elections in this country is changing from an administrative point of view. From the political level, I think one or two new players might feature, even if they don't get outright majority, but their presence will be felt. So we are dealing with a moving target here, an election culture that is evolving as we seek to consolidate our democratic culture.
Professor Hanyane, Professor of Northwest, really do appreciate the time. Thank you, Professor of Politics there. In a moment,